All right, hello and welcome back to another week of Exploring Digital Media. This week we're going to talk about the basics of video production. We have kind of wrapped up our still photography component, which has been a lot of fun. It's been really fun to see what you guys have done. We're excited to see your projects. And so now we move into the world of video where we're talking about more than just one frame at a time. So speaking of which, right, as I said, we've been focused on one frame, but now our camera is literally capturing at high speed multiple frames at a time. So there's a lot more that we have to think about as we do this. So we refer to how many times we see an image per second as the frame rate for a video. And what is the frame rate of film? Like you go see a movie in the theater, what is the kind of typical frame rate you'll see? Anybody know?
A few answers from online.
Yeah?
Mostly 24 frames per second.
24 frames per second, yes, exactly. And certainly like this graphic shows 60 FPS, 60 frames per second. What is 60 frames per second? Why choose one versus the other? That's kind of some of what we're going to unpack a little bit tonight. But how about broadcast television? How many frames per second is that shown at?
24.
24, no, it's not. So it goes back to some old standards, but 60 frames per second is what broadcast television is sent at. And that doesn't mean that the content that you're viewing was recorded at 60 frames per second necessarily, but it has been conformed to 60 frames per second as you watch it back. All right, so as far as frame rate goes, this all kind of comes down to human perception and how do we determine like that 24 frames per second is how did that become the standard for filmmaking? So let's look at a couple of clips here, starting with just 3 frames per second, as you see in the top right corner. Let's watch this and see how this little clip feels. And to be clear, this is a video that was shot at a higher frame rate and has been conformed to 3 frames per second, but the effect is the same. Like, how did this motion feel? Very unnatural, right? Very kind of not pleasant to watch. You're noticing every single frame rather than watching the motion of the people walking. All right, so let's jump ahead here. Here's 6 frames per second. How does this one feel? All right, we're getting there. We're kind of still seeing quite a bit of judder, as we refer to as a frame rate that is very low and kind of clunky like that. Let's move ahead to 12 frames per second. Okay, is that starting to feel a bit more like a natural motion? Yeah, and let's double up one more time. Let's go to 24 frames per second, as we've already discussed as the kind of standard frame rate for film. And so this kind of comes down to what it is that we're looking at. We're looking at a group of pictures in a rapid succession. That's all video is. It's encoded a bit more smartly than that, but at the end of the day, you're really just looking at pictures being, it's like a flip book that you open and flip through very quickly. The images move forward. So 24 frames per second has kind of become the standard. Does anybody know the reasoning for why that was initially the standard back, I don't even know the year that it was established, but
I actually don't off the top of my head either.
Yeah.
So I should look that up.
So we'll look that one up. But 12 frames per second is kind of where we start to not be able to distinguish the difference between the still images being flashed before us, but 24 frames per second is the standard. So my question is why? No? Go ahead, Alec.
I was just saying to save money for 24
Yeah, well, that's
frames.
that's interesting. That's a part of it. So on this film strip here, we had 24 frames per second. I'm sorry, where you have your film, you've got your picture encoded alongside your audio. So the audio track actually ran alongside the picture. And one of the reasons, like the film is not cheap, so we wanted to find a way to kind of use as little as possible, but we also needed to have enough fidelity in the audio that it sounded nice and clear and sharp and was not too muddy and that you could actually understand it. And 24 frames was a good frame rate for that. It didn't cost too much. You had a good natural motion to it, and you had good audio fidelity. So that's kind of where the standard was set. So the audio, as I said. And so as we define our frame rate, we can kind of pick and choose this, right? If you open up Shotcut or Adobe Premiere or whatever nonlinear editing system you're using, you can say, hey, I want my project to be at this frame rate. And so you can also additionally set your camera and say, I want to shoot at 24 frames per second, I want to shoot at 30 frames per second, I want to shoot at 60 frames per second. It kind of depends on the hardware that you're actually using. So, but common frame rates that we might see, 24 is equivalent to what we usually see for film. A common video standard is actually 30 frames per second. The soap opera effect, where everything is kind of very smooth, that comes down to a 60 frames per second playback. And then you've got some higher frame rates at the other end that can be used for specialty things. So you might have a camera where you're kind of saying, hey, how do I actually set my frame rate in my camera? And so if you've got a Canon, it might look like this. If you've got a Nikon like this and a Sony like this. And the idea is that you choose your frame size, the actual width by height, as well as how many frames per second. And so looking here top left with the Canon frame size, we've got 1920, which is short for an HD frame, or 1920 by 1080 as the resolution, at 30 frames per second. The all-I in this case just refers to how the frames are actually encoded and means that it's easier for a nonlinear editing system to actually access every frame. When you get these IPB frames, it's just a lighter weight version of encoding where it's harder to decode, is really what we need to know, but it's much more space efficient. So if you're given this option, like on a Canon camera, choose the all-I. And so you can choose 30 frames per second, 24 frames per second, or you can jump down to the smaller resolution of HD video, which is 1280 by 720, or 720p for short. And so you can choose either of those as well. Nikon looks pretty much the same, and with Sony, you actually need to choose your codec, what the video is actually being stored as. Codec is simply that kind of container that holds all the frames together and defines how it is actually encoded, but we don't need to know those details. We just need to know that you can actually choose on this camera. And if you're using Sony, XAVC is just the kind of newer video codec that they are using. So choose that, and then you can choose what frame rate and frame size you want. All right, so overcranking and undercranking. Does anybody know what these terms mean offhand? We're talking about frame rates. That's a little hint. This GIF here, or GIF, however you want to say it, is a hint as well, right? Overcranking. What might this be? Any guesses from online? All right, so what is this hand doing as it cranks? What's happening? What are we looking at? We're looking at an antique camera. But we're seeing two kind of things happen in the camera. We're seeing this kind of wheel go around, and we're seeing this bar here kind of slide up and down. Any guesses?
Does it mean maybe that the hand movement is speeding?
Yeah.
Kind of the succession of the
Yes.
images up and down.
Yeah, Benjamin is saying, is this actually control the speed, right? The images are moving up and down. So this is the shutter that we're seeing. We're used to talking about shutter speed from still photography. And then this is I don't know what this is technically called, but it advances the frames of film down through the camera as it moves. And in the old school cameras, it literally was a matter of kind of keeping a constant crank going to determine your frame rate.
It's called the claw.
A what?
The claw.
The claw. Okay, yeah, so the claw hooks into the perforation on the film and pulls the frame down. And so what happens if you start to crank this more quickly? You overcrank. The film advances faster, right? And so what is the effect of that if you were to play it back?
Fast motion.
Well, fast motion is what you would think, right? You record a lot of frames very quickly, but if you were to play them back at your normal frame rate, the 24 frames per second, it's going to be slow motion. So it's kind of counterintuitive in that sense, but it's because you're cranking very quickly, recording a lot of data, and then playing it back more slowly, you get slow motion. So we thought that to kind of show what this example looked like, we'd set up in this beautiful Harvard library and recruit a boxer to kind of come in and show us what different frame rates can look like. So here we go. We've got Connor Doyle here being a guest for us. So, oh yes, just a little hint as to what the setup looked like. So the things we want to keep in mind here, I've kind of alluded to these, are the kind of captured frame rate. This is the frame rate that you set your camera to, how many frames per second you're recording, versus your project frame rate, or your timeline frame rate. How many frames per second are being played back over the sequence? And they matter if they're the same thing, right? So here we have, if you look at the top right of this frame, we've got 24 frames per second being played back at 24 frames per second. This is going to be a real-time playback. So as we watch this, Connor's punching the punching bag here. All right, feels like normal time. If you were standing there watching him, this is the speed at which it happened. All right, but if we look at we overcranked here. We were cranked very quickly. We recorded 250 frames per second, and we play it back at 24 frames per second. Roughly what's the time delta here? How many times slower is this going to be? 10 times? Yeah. Because 24 times 10 is 240. We'll round up to 250. So 250 frames per second, his punching should be about 1/10 of the speed of normal time when we play it back. And here it is. So it really matters here, what is it that we want to do? Do we want to slow things down? We need to shoot at a higher frame rate. But how much higher do we need to shoot? And that depends on how fast your sequence is, how many frames per second you're going to play back that your viewer is going to watch. All right, we'll go through a few different stops. Here's 250 frames at 250 frames. So what do we suspect that we'll see in this version?
Again, lifelike.
Yeah, real time, right? Lifelike. Let's see. Is this lifelike? It feels very different, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Feels faster.
Feels faster. Okay. We'll unpack this a little bit.
But the time it takes for him to punch is sort of the same amount, right?
Yeah.
But it has a different feeling. That's really it.
Exactly. All right. How about 120 frames at 24 frames per second? Right. I don't need to keep beating this over and over again. This is still slow, not quite as slow as it was before, but you get different amounts of detail as we kind of do this as well, right? Good jab there, Connor. If you don't know, Connor is one of our camera operators for this class, so he very nicely volunteered to work with us on this. All right, 60 frames per second. All right, so we're getting faster. We're getting a little bit more. We're actually losing a little bit more detail. All right, 30 frames per second. So this is almost real time. This is very slightly slowed down. All right, and then 12 frames per second. What's going to happen here? Right, so we're now talking about, this is going to be on the undercranking side, right? So we're turning the frames per second more slowly than what we're playing them back at, which is going to result in, we've just looked at slow motion, this is going to be fast motion, right? It's almost like an old-timey film. All right, so this is how fast compared to real time, because it's easy math to do. Yeah, twice as fast, exactly. So, yeah. And then 12 frames per second at 12 frames per second. How is this going to equate? It's going to be real time still. How's it going to look, though?
Slower.
It's going to be, well, what do you define slower?
It's going to feel slower.
It's going to feel slower. OK, let's see if it feels slower.
Oh,
Right, it's just more choppy, right? We got a lot more judder in this frame. But the action is still happening at the same rate. So very interesting, the choices we make with how much we capture at and how much we play back at. And then 4 frames per second. So this is going to be a quarter of real time, or 4 times real time. I got to invert my math very quickly here. Right, so we're looking at a lot of extremes, but you can see that there's certainly in between where things could be useful. If you want to kind of have this dreamlike fashion, maybe you want to record at 60 frames per second and play back at 24 frames per second. Or if you really want to highlight, something that happens quickly, like let's say like a whip hitting something, you might want to shoot that even faster, 120 or 250 frames per second, and then play it back at 24 frames per second.
Is this what's happening like in all Charlie Chaplin films, or where things?
Yes. So that really comes down to the fact that they were sort of unstandardized in their frame rates. The very early film was like hand cranked. And so you can imagine if you had to crank through 100 feet of film, you would start fast and sort of slow down as you got more and more tired. So there's a sort of a variable frame rate to those. And then when it became mechanical, a lot of films were shot at 18 frames per second, which is slower than 24, and it has that sort of staccato feel to it, where everything feels a little bit sped up because we now watch it at 24 frames per second, right? in playback. So it actually, that translation is happening there. But that's exactly it, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so if you want to actually watch these examples, download the slides, and this is just a link to a playlist where you can watch these videos in your own time. And so here's a more extreme video for you. You can watch how much time passes here. This is actually over the course of 5 days. So this is an extreme version of undercranking, where we get to watch some rain, watch these flowers kind of grow up and bloom. Right, so kind of like, not as pretty as like an actual nature show, but the idea is the same, where you're compressing time here, which is a really interesting thing to do. So given that we know a little bit now about how different frame rates play back and how it kind of gives a little bit different feeling, let's put this in context and actually watch a clip and discuss this together. So this is a clip from Mr. Robot Season 8, and they do a really interesting thing in this clip. So we'll just take a look. It's just a short clip, and then we'll talk about it. If we can dim the lights, please.
I gotta do that now. Security token. Gideon's phone. I need his phone. 50 hours and 19 minutes left. Damn, she infected me with her time paranoia. We're all living in each other's paranoia. You definitely can't argue that. Is that why everyone tries to avoid each other? I need to calm down. I wish I could be an observer like you. Then I could think more calmly. This is comfortable, less stressful. In fact, I feel like I can see everything, know everything this way. Do you know more than me? That wouldn't be fair. My imaginary friend knowing more than me. So what would you do now? We need a distraction to get Gideon's phone.
Darling, I need you to do something for me.
She can help.
All right, so let's talk about what we just saw for a second. Right, so just to give a little context, Elliot here, our computer hacker, is under deadline. There's something looming that's going to happen, and so he starts off, a little bit anxious about what's going on, and he kind of takes a moment to talk to us, his imaginary friend, the audience, and put himself in our shoes for a second. But visually, what do we see? Let's talk about this. Let's back up and actually look. If I can find my mouse, there it is. So at the beginning, describe the frame rate for me. How does this part feel?
No. Security token. Gideon's phone. I need his phone. 50.
I'm sorry, what was it?
Overcranked.
Overcranked? Why overcranked?
Or faster.
Faster?
Playing.
Potentially, but like a relatively normal frame rate, right? It felt a little bit frantic, I think is the kind of description that maybe fits the feeling of it. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But it was probably pretty close to real time, right? We didn't feel like we lost a whole lot of data necessarily. All right, and then what happens? There's a change.
She infected me with her time paranoia. We're all living in each other's paranoia. You definitely can't argue that. Is that why everyone tries to avoid each other? I need to calm down. I wish I could be an observer like you. Then I could think more calmly.
So there's actually a frame rate change that's ramped up in the clip, right? So we actually changed the rate of playback, which is done in post-production, over some number of seconds to this overcranking, right, where we see a slower playback, and gives this kind of dreamlike effect, right?
Very contemplative.
Yeah, and like the rest of the effect for us, the audience, as we watch this, is that the rest of the world literally slows down. It's narrated still in real time, so it feels like we're kind of, as Elliot takes a look around and kind of sees things, I think he says, we kind of feel that with him. All right, a fun example there. So as far as what happens to us as we start to shoot video and look at more than one frame at a time, going back to our exposure triangle, where we are now controlling our aperture, our ISO, and our shutter speed, what limitation are we going to bump up against if we're shooting some number of frames per second? one of these is going to kind of get locked off on us. Anybody know?
Shutter speed.
Shutter speed, why?
I feel like, from what I've learned thus far, that it is directly tied to the frame rate.
Yeah. Well, if you think about what is actually happening with shutter speed, so yes, the answer shutter speed is kind of locked. So the shutter of the camera, right, in the old mechanical camera here, we've got this like notch that's cut out and that rotated around and exposed the film. If we look at the modern equivalent of that, we have this, let's say with this shutter right here, we've got time when the disc spins around where the film plane or the sensor plane is exposed and when it's closed off. And so that represents how much time is exposed, how much time the film is actually exposed for. So if our frame rate is 24 frames per second, that means that the film needs to advance past this thing here 24 times per second. So what's the longest if we had no shutter covering this and it was just light coming through? What's the longest exposure we could have, right, if it's 24 frames per second?
The answer on the bottom?
No. But right, it's 1/24th of a second, right, because there's nothing to block any light. So the answer is 1/24th of a second is the longest exposure that we could have. And so just shooting your digital photography 1/24th of a second, is that a long shutter speed? Is it fast? Like what kind of motion would you get from that?
You would incorporate motion blur.
You're going to get motion blur, right? Yeah. So what if you're shooting faster than 24 frames per second? Let's say you're shooting, I don't know, 120 frames per second. What is the most, with no shutter involved, what is the most exposure you can get from your shutter speed?
With no shutter involved?
Let's just say you like, yeah, I mean, digital cameras don't actually have a physical shutter. Some do, most don't. So let's say we take the shutter out of the equation. What is the longest exposure time we could have at 120 frames per second?
I don't know how to answer that question.
It's one over the frame rate, right? Because it's literally 1/120th of a second. And so again, thinking back to when you're out shooting with your camera, what kind of, can you get motion blur from 1/120th of a second?
Depending on the subject. If
Yeah.
it's moving quickly.
Sure. If it's moving very quickly, yes, that's a good point. I shouldn't say you can't, because you can. But like your kind of natural motion blur that we're kind of used to seeing as humans is going to be, we're going to lose that. It's going to everything will be sharper. And so if you think back to old film cameras, right, we had to actually close the shutter for some period of time so that the film could advance. Otherwise, everything would just be this kind of blur effect as you advance the film through the camera. And so, at 24 frames per second, kind of a typical shutter that gives us natural motion blur is 1/2 of your time being exposed. So the frame is covered for half of the time and then open for half the time. So basically, for 24 frames per second, that's why we get a 1/48th shutter speed is kind of our natural shutter speed, because we're exposing for half of the time of the frame rate. So if we were exposing for the whole time of the frame rate, it would be 1/24. But because we're exposing for half of that, we double that number, and it goes 1/48. Does that make sense? Did I bungle that?
No.
Okay. So if we spin these, we kind of get a sense of this, right? So we've got the film advancing through, right, getting exposed. But as we start to kind of close down the shutter, as we talked about what happens when we shoot at faster shutter speeds, again, these numbers at the bottom are all 24 frames per second that relate to this, because 24 frames per second is what we're going to say is the kind of typical film frame rate. So we're going to talk about that frame rate a lot. So a normal shutter speed is going to be 1/48 per second, and not all cameras can do that. Sometimes, like I know the Canon 5D, it's like 1/50, but that's close enough. We're gonna say we are in the ballpark for that, right? And so, what is a 90-degree shutter angle going to do? And it's literally because of the shape of this cutout here. That's where the 90 degrees comes from. That's where the 180 degrees comes from, right? But if we think about what that actually means, right, 180 degrees means that our exposure time is half of our frame interval. What's half of our frame interval of a 90-degree shutter? Right, let's start down here, right? So we know that 1/48,
Quarter.
right, is half. Yeah, so is a quarter, but we double the 48 and we get to 96. So 1/96th is a 90-degree shutter. But what is the visual effect for us, right? Forget even knowing these numbers, because ultimately at the end of the day, you can look through your camera and change your shutter speed and see what effect you get. But what happens as we sharpen up our shutter, make it more quick? Sharpen up our shutter is the key there.
Yeah.
Sharper.
Yeah, right. We lose our motion blur, right? This is really what I'm trying to hammer home here. Is like the faster the shutter speed, the less motion blur we have. We know this from digital photography already, and the same is true with video. But with video, as images move in sequence, we kind of expect a certain amount of blur, and that goes away when we shoot higher frame rate because our shutter speed is maxed out, or if we change our shutter speed. And that's why I put the lock on the exposure triangle, because if you want to have natural motion blur and have video that we are used to seeing over the years of watching movies and films, you want your shutter speed to be roughly 1/48 at 24 frames per second. And so here's the slide for that.
Yeah, so again, this is sort of conventional motion, right? The natural feeling motion in video, but you can definitely push and pull it in either direction. You just can't go below the frame rate, the period of the frame rate for your shutter speed. So you can't get any blurrier than 1/24 if you're shooting at 24 frames per second.
What would happen if you did?
Well, you couldn't, because you would ask the camera to record an image for longer than one frame, right? So you'd be trying to record a single image for 2 frames, which you can't. So you can't go any slower than 1/24. But you can go faster. You can take a shorter image in that 1/24 of a second. You just can't go longer than that, because then it would be recording over 2 frames, and your frame rate wouldn't be 24 frames per second.
Because you wouldn't be able to use that in post, would you?
Well,
You just couldn't do it, because if you tried to record longer than 1/24, right, then you're not shooting at 24 frames per second. You're shooting at some smaller amount than that.
I want to try this.
your camera will not even let you do it, because it's the laws of physics will not allow it.
Oh yeah? We'll see about that.
All right, Ralph, let's see it. And so I mentioned this already, but some cameras can't actually do 1/48, so use 150 instead. And like this is really a guide if you're coming into this class and you have not touched video before and you're not sure what to set your camera to. If you want to have a traditional cinematic look, set your camera to 24 frames per second. Sometimes that is abbreviated as 23.98. That is, for all intents and purposes, the same thing, with a shutter speed of 1/48, which is our 180-degree shutter angle. Potato, we showed the graphic of what the shutter looked like back in the day. It was when there was a circle, and you actually would open and close the angle of it. And so now we typically talk about shutter speed as fractions, and it's all about the exposure time. So 1/48 of a second is equivalent to a 180-degree shutter. And refer back to the graphic I just showed that kind of animated to see why. Okay, so what happens as we start to play with the shutter speed in the video? Let's go back to our boxing example. And so we're watching all 24 frames per second video here, played back at 24 frames per second. And this is going to be just kind of a study of motion blur. So I said before, what happens if we just like take the shutter out of the equation, right? So a 360-degree shutter is literally no shutter at all, right? So it's just constantly light hitting the sensor per frame. We're on a tripod, so not everything in the frame is going to blur for us. But let's take a look at what happens with our motion. Right, how fast is Connor punching here?
It looks really fast.
So fast, right? So yeah, here is a freeze frame of that motion blur, right? So an incredible amount of motion blur, because we're looking at 1/24 of a second here in time, right? Because there's no shutter closing. It's just 1/24 of a second because our frame rate is 24 frames per second.
And when we did our still photography, right, it was really easy to capture human motion blur at 1/24 of a second. Our suggestion was shoot at 1/60th or 1/50th or something like that to sort of stop that normal human motion blur.
Exactly. All right, so we're going to half this. And I guess this is the other factor too, right? As we think about exposure, as we change shutter speed, right? So the same frame for the same amount of time is like in the window, or is being exposed. But if we half the amount of time that the shutter is open for that frame, how much light is being taken away?
Well, stop. No, 2's up.
No, you're good.
Yeah,
1.
exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to compensate. Just like, this is exactly the same thing as when we shot still photography, right? We had to compensate for when we changed the shutter speed, we had to compensate with ISO or aperture. The same thing applies to video. It's just confusing because there are more frames involved. So that's all, but the same principles apply. If we cut the shutter speed in half, that's one stop of light that we need to compensate for on the other end somewhere else. All right, so here's a 180-degree shutter. Right, so half as much motion blur. Can we qualify it that way? I mean, it's half as much time, half as much light. Yeah. So, does that equate visually? Maybe not, right? Here's what that motion blur looks like. It looks pretty similar to me to the 360 degree, right? But let's keep going down this rabbit hole. So this is a 90-degree shutter, or translated 1/96th of a second.
So that's one more stop close down, right?
Yes. Yep, we keep doing halves here. Yeah. Right, so this is feeling a little bit different now, huh? Just a little bit. Does it feel faster, slower? A little bit subjective, I'd say, using words like that. Here's a freeze. But we're starting to get more detail, right?
And choppy.
It's feeling choppier.
It's less smooth for sure.
Yeah, so less smooth because as the frames kind of go by very quickly and our human eyes only see kind of the combination of all of them put together, we're losing this motion blur that we're used to seeing, and we're starting to see more detail in every frame.
His arm in the punch motion gets shorter and more, I guess, realistic, because it was before his glove was like really long, because the shutter speed is at 24, the same as the frames per second. So it is definitely getting sharper, which makes it choppy, which I'm starting to get more clearly.
Yeah, exactly, because you literally are seeing it more clearly. That's exactly why it's becoming more choppy. It's because you're actually seeing his arm is not extending anymore and bending with the light that is hitting your sensor, right? It's actually staying the same size as it moves because we're not getting that motion blur.
Which is a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, okay. In this case, it's a little uncomfortable maybe. All right, Ralph, taking it to the next level here. All right, so let's look at a 45-degree shutter, right? This makes our shutter speed 1/192, so a very small fraction of a second now. Looks cool. Right, whereas before when he was punching really fast, we saw just kind of a blur. Now we're just kind of seeing like fists flying, the actual outline of the fists. I think we actually, we went a couple more stops here, so let's keep looking. Here's a freeze of the motion blur just to compare apples to apples. All right, so let's go down to it. Again, we're halving and halving and halving and halving. So a 22.5-degree shutter, or 1/384th of a second. It's kind of weird to watch. Like, we're just not used to seeing a whole lot of footage that looks like this as humans.
I can see this in a boxing movie because it looks good still. Like the last one before we went here was usable for like fast fight scene.
That's interesting. So you're kind of saying that in your mind a fight scene might have some of this kind of fast, crisp motion.
Oh yeah.
Right? But it doesn't have to, right? You could certainly shoot a fight scene with no shutter at all, or with 1/24th of a second, but that's not what we're used to seeing because convention tells us that you have this kind of this fast shutter, right? And even if we think back to Mr. Robot at the end of the scene that we watched when we'll come back to that clip in a second. I want to go back and look at that though. All right, let's just finish our iteration here. So this is a freeze frame of the motion blur, right? There's still a little bit of motion blur because he's moving very fast. But any average thing that's happening, a person walking, a car driving by slowly, would probably be fairly frozen in the freeze frame. All right, so our last stop here is an 11-degree shutter, which is 1/768th of a second, right? We know our DSLRs can probably do 1/2000th of a second, or 1/4000th, or 1/8000th of a second. It would just be pretty wild to see that with video, but here we go. So give me some adjectives that describes this frame, maybe versus the first frame that we looked at. Like, it's a stark difference. Okay. Is it more comfortable to watch, less comfortable?
It's more unnatural.
It's more natural?
More unnatural.
Oh, more unnatural. Okay.
You can almost read what's written on the video.
Yeah, here's the freeze frame, right? And so I tried to grab all the freeze frames in the middle of like the punching action. So we're in the first frame. Let's look at the comparison. So in the first frame, right, it was just like no clear delineation of his arm. As we kind of get down, right, we're starting to get a bit more clear as we get to 1/96th of a second, right? But once we get down to like 1/768th or one, did I put these out of order? 92. Where's the highest one? Yeah. It is. Okay, so I'll rearrange these and repost it. But this is our fastest shutter speed, which just clearly has the least amount of motion blur. But again, we're talking about multiple frames per second. As we watch this, it's just a very different effect than what we see. So if you're going out to shoot a video of somebody just casually walking down the street and that your subject is walking, would you choose, which would you choose? Like, which are we kind of conditioned to seeing? And I've already given the answer away, but right, this one, the 1/48th of a second shutter speed if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, right? So this is the kind of natural motion blur we're used to seeing. Of course, Connor is punching very fast, so we just get a whole lot of blur. All right, if you want to watch these examples on your own, click the link at the bottom.
I am punching.
That's Connor, yep. You give a wave, Connor.
Do not get into a fight with this guy.
Yeah.
That's cool, man.
If you're trying to kind of do this conversion in your head, we've made a chart here for you. So at 24 frames per second, if you're trying to figure out what you want to achieve one of the effects that we've looked at, like let's say you want to have that frozen motion, right? If you want the 45-degree shutter angle look, you'd set your camera to 192 frames per second. And then we also do the higher frame rates for you as well. All right, so this is about a 2-minute clip. This is it's shortened from the beginning of Saving Private Ryan. I cut out some of the violence, and there's no sound, just so we can watch visually what happens. But let's watch this clip, and then let's talk about it. But there are some interesting things that happen here with both shutter speed and frame rate. Yes?
Did you want to go back to Mr. Robot? You did mention it before.
I did. OK, let's do that first, Ralph. You're right. So before we go to this, let me back up to Mr. Robot.
Because I would have forgotten. If I were you, that's all. Let me just say something.
Yes, thank you. You are so right. All right, so let's watch this again. Maybe we can lose the audio on this one. So what does the shutter speed feel like here to you? Is it? And I don't mean like tell me what the shutter speed is, but is it fast or slow?
It seems like it's 192, so fast.
It feels sharp, right? Like there's not much motion blur in watching him walk.
Right.
Okay. So then. Right. It's almost like it's kind of hard to, unless you're talking about it, it's kind of hard to put your finger on almost, because it's not so much that as the average viewer sitting on your couch watching, it's going to jump out at you, but it's going to kind of subconsciously impact you. So, and then we slow down here. So how do you think that they actually captured this scene?
I'm glad you went. This is what I was thinking about the whole time.
Yeah.
Is this one shot?
I pose that to you. Is it one shot?
It seems
Because they do cut, right? They do cut. There are cuts in this scene. Right? We're next to him. So let's see at the point, if we can find the point where it actually slows down.
Wow.
And there it is right there, right? You can see it in his step. So it does ramp. So it is one shot. So what did they record this at?
60 FPS.
Well, we don't know the actual number, right? We're not going to know that. But we can say that they probably this was an overcrank shot, right? They shot at a high frame rate, which meant that the most open their shutter could be was still pretty fast. It meant that the shutter speed was still fast, which meant that there was very little motion blur, right? And so then in post-production, when they got back there, the beginning of the clip is probably conformed to 24 frames per second so that you're watching it and it feels like the normal time playback. Right? But then they ramp it. They have all these extra frames. Like they're just kind of throwing away all these in-between frames. And then they stretch out. They do that ramp when they get to this part here. And everything slows down. And it's very beautiful and slow. And we no longer notice the shutter speed as much because everything is moving more slowly. But when we speed back up at the end, the motion blur, sorry, not the motion blur. When we go speed back up at the end, it's the motion blur is gone. It's back to being choppy. So my guess is that they did this in one shot, the actual motion blur part.
It's impressive.
All right, so anyway, let's come back to Saving Private Ryan and kind of put all these ideas together. And this is, again, about a 2-minute clip. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering this film for you, because it is a wonderful film, but I did trim it to reduce some violence and to kind of speed things along for discussion's sake. So if we can dim the lights, please. All right. So, did you catch some of the changes that we saw in the film? Let's walk back through it together. So let's set up, how do we feel at the beginning as far as frame rate and shutter speed go? How does this part feel? We'll even pause it for a second. Is there motion blur? I'm sorry, what did you say? No. Anybody else? Does it feel like natural, unnatural?
How does the time it takes for the action to unfold on screen feel? Does that part feel natural?
Felt the normal speed for me until.
Yeah. Okay, so this part we'll say roughly normal speed. But you said, I heard the word until, which means there's a change, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So even in here, right, if we look at the actual water here, there's motion blur, right? This is frozen, or not frozen. So, okay. Let's go ahead and move forward again. Let's move forward to this part here. There's a change that happens here.
Slow that down in post.
Yeah, this is interesting. So Ralph, what did you say?
The shot with Tom Hanks was slowed down in post, but this next shot could have been shot with a completely different shutter speed because it just looks way more motion blurry.
Sure. So you're saying it was slowed down in post. So unpack that for me a little bit. Let's just hypothesize what frame rate they were shooting at.
If I were them, I would have been shooting at, let's say, 24 frames per second as it was calling in because it seems regular.
Mm-hmm.
And then they slowed it down after the fact to give it more of a drama and like.
So you're playing back, let's say, 12 frames per second, 15 frames per second, something like that?
Some lesser number to
Okay.
give it more.
And visually for us to create this drama, as you describe, it's slowing it down, so we're watching it in slower than real time, but there's bigger chunks of time between each frame that we're seeing, right?
Yes, exactly. So
Which
you
is
can see
kinda
like him just sitting there looks really blurry. So it's like you're seeing him think a lot and observe what's happening. So you're starting to feel what he feels.
Yeah,
Even though there's no audio, I was like, man, that sucks.
yeah.
That's what I was thinking. So.
Yeah, so you're saying we're starting to identify with him and feel how he feels. Okay, So all this kind of chaos revolves around him, but it changes back again, right? Is there a trigger that changes it back? All right, well, I made an edit there.
Oh, that would be the cut.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're back to the same kind of effect, right? Helmet goes back on. And then there's this shot that comes up here. Here.
So the cut between him being, I don't want to keep talking. Is there anyone else going to talk?
Anybody else? Yeah, Ralph's been saying it all. Anything from the internet, Ian?
Yeah, a lot of people are sort of mentioning that it's like early part is reminiscent of sort of war photography and that kind of aesthetic and things like that, which you can imagine that there's some higher shutter speeds used in that to sort of capture action.
Absolutely. All right, so then there's this moment where he's kind of like shell-shocked by this whole kind of hitting the beach, right? And we've got this other soldiers yelling in his face for a second, and totally like what feels much more normal and natural, right? Especially juxtaposed to the slow frame rate playback. And then there's another shift. So he gets back with it. He runs up on the beach, and there's another shift. Where is it? I think it's right after this. So right here, watch all the explosions that happen now. See if I can pause on one. Did I miss it? There we go. Okay, so if we look over here on the right side of the frame at the kind of dirt that's falling here, everything's very clear. So what do we... Crisp, thank you. What do we hypothesize is happening now? Was it faster or slower motion at all? Or was it normal speed?
Probably a slightly higher speed.
All right, possibly slightly higher speed. How about motion blur? Is there any motion blur going on? Ignore the compression artifacts in the out of focus areas. Don't confuse them.
Yeah, I was like, it's
But for this whole, from the moment that I kind of said here is the, right here. This is where my eye starts to really notice it. But like, just all the detail, you can see all of the bits of dirt and all the action is really happening. And so this is not traditional of kind of your cinematic look, but what is it that has changed most likely? So it's possibly a slightly different frame rate, but I would say the action happens similar to what we see, like the time it takes them to run across the beach is similar to what we expect a human to take to run across the beach. But what is the visual artifact? And again, we're looking at a bunch of compression here as I pause this, but as you watch it in rapid succession, faster shutter speed, right? It's like you see all the detail and all the crispness. And I think it adds to what Benjamin is seeing here with you get all the detail, all this detail that you don't otherwise, you're not used to seeing. You're used to seeing all this stuff hidden in the motion blur as you watch. Yeah, so this feels very sharp. And even this kind of chaotic camera movement is exaggerated because of the shutter speed, right? And I think that is actually what could lead to what feels like a slightly slower shutter speed or slightly slower frame rate is because the shutter speed is higher and just you feel like there's bigger chunks of time cut out because everything is sharper, there's no blur. If that makes sense.
I would love to see the behind the scenes of that cameraman's movement. Because I want to see what he was doing.
I think it was just like this, you know? He dipped down at one point and then he came back up. But the thing is, I think it is though. The magic is that the exposure settings were changed, right? That's really what it comes down to. It's that shutter speed is what makes this so impactful.
We say simple, but operating, a 40-pound camera on a beach as you run is not
in a bunch
simple.
of explosions.
Yeah,
and people running around
in any way, shape, or form.
All right. So in a nutshell, shutter speed matters a lot. But if you want a typical cinematic look, what is the number you want to target? Somebody besides Ralph?
24 FPS.
24 frames per second.
And 148.
And 1/48th of a second shutter speed is a good baseline for where you should start from. All right. The Jello Effect. Does anybody know what this is?
A delicious.
Besides a delicious snack. Thank you, Ralph. Does anybody know have you seen what I'm referring to? You might not have.
I'll hop in on that one.
Okay, Alec, let's hear it.
It's from CCDs not having a specific shutter speed. The bucket brigade, the lines, so you get a sliding effect instead of an even shutter look.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to unpack that a little bit here. So it actually, you said CCD, you're getting very technical in a sensor type. It's actually a product of CMOS sensors, which I wasn't even going to talk about. But the idea is this. So it's called rolling shutter, but I want to be clear that this has nothing to do with the actual shutter speed of the camera. Watch the kind of warping that happens as the camera whips back and forth very quickly. This all has to do with sensor technology and nothing to do with shutter speed, even though it's called rolling shutter. Right, so it's really pronounced as you wiggle a camera like this. Right, so this is a Canon 5D Mark IV. Let's look at the same thing again on a Red Epic Dragon.
Nice. Oh. Is there any rolling shutter in this shot?
Hold on, wait for the wiggle.
Okay.
You tell me, what do you think, Ralph?
Minimal.
Minimal?
That's excellent rolling shutter.
Okay, so we see a little bit of this effect, but hopefully it's clear. I'm not sure what the internet is doing to the video, but if we look at the 5D Mark IV again, and let's pause it in the middle of a wiggle here. Right, let me pause it, yeah. Ah, my goodness.
You got this, Dan.
Thanks, Ralph. Okay, so look how everything just kind of warps, right? And it's more than just motion blur. It's kind of bending the whole image. And when you see this rapidly put together, it gives us this Jello effect where the whole frame kind of looks like jelly. And you notice it very much with vertical straight lines in particular. Not all sensors are created equal. I find that the 5D Mark IV is not very good. The early versions of the Sony A7S camera, also not very good. But the more money you kind of spend on a sensor, typically, the more reduced this effect is. But why do we care? Like, this is an interesting thing, right? It could be used for something.
Or it can ruin your shot.
Or it could ruin your shot. Thank you. That's exactly it, right? Like, if you are trying to follow somebody across the screen and they start to bend on you, right? That's not something that you might necessarily want. Maybe it is, but it's a limitation that we need to be aware of.
Or if something's moving even faster too, right?
Yeah.
Like, you'll end up with more pronounced sort of warpage based off the rolling shutter effect.
Yeah. And so there are software tools to reduce this. We're not going to talk about those too much in this class. But really, it's kind of a warning that you should be aware of what the limitations of your camera are, and whatever camera you're using. I encourage you to actually do this, like set the camera up to 24 frames per second, 1/48 shutter speed, and just wiggle it back and forth and see how much rolling shutter you have, shutter roll. Because on some cameras are kind of just egregious at this. Like the A7S Mark I was just horrendous if you were doing any kind of pan. So it's just something to be aware of. And again, nothing to do with shutter. Yes, Ralph?
What would happen if this was shot at 24 frames per second, but at 192?
Shutter speed?
Yeah, would there still be a Jello effect?
Yes.
Yes.
Really?
Yes, because let me explain why.
I'm so curious.
So what's actually happening here is that a rolling shutter does this. It kind of has this activation phase where, let's pretend this is your whole image. And so it gets activated. And then this, once the exposure is complete, we have this kind of deactivate and save to disk that happens.
Yeah. So there's like a pixel array, right, on your sensor, and it activates line by line. And so it starts as this green bar moves down, activating each line, and then reads off as the red bar moves down.
And that's why the vertical lines show us.
Yeah, because
Exactly.
something during that time, something can move,
Yeah.
change position.
You're literally watching time bend, right?
Whereas this reads off, sort of lets everything fill in and then reads off.
Does
And
the
saves.
Red Epic Dragon, or the red cameras have global shutters?
They have rolling shutters, and you saw it a little bit. You said when we saw the camera wiggle, there's a little bit there, but it's much less pronounced, right? So most cameras have this technology in them.
Is that just software that makes it more?
It has to do with the actual physical sensor and the electronics in the sensor itself. But here's
so it is hardware, but it also is the circuitry and the software of the hardware components interacting with each other. So to answer your question.
So more expensive.
Yeah, that's exactly
Better quality.
But let's go back to, let's see. Let's go back to this slide for a second. Right, this is an old, what is the shutter called, the round one? I don't know. I'm just trying to remember what the circle shutter is called. But did this have a rolling shutter effect too? I mean, think about it, right? This disc spins around. Let me go back to the graphic where it's actually spinning. Right, so as this spins, right, part of the frame, notice the point like here, right? So part of the frame is exposed and then part of it's covered up. Yeah. Would that have the same effect?
Yes.
Well, so is the top right corner and the bottom left corner exposed at the same time or different times?
Well, it would depend on where the shutter is, right? So if the shutter is covering some of it, then no.
Well, which corner is exposed first?
The top.
Yeah. But that means it basically is exposing this part, and then some amount of time later, it's exposing this part. So it's just like the way the rolling shutter is rolling down. It's sort of reading the data from the top of the frame, and then sometime later, reading the data from the bottom.
Instead of top to bottom.
Yeah. Well, so it's just yeah, exactly. The shape is different, but it's the same sort of effect where one part of the frame is read before another part of the frame.
Okay.
Right, or exposed before another part of the frame.
Still exposed for the same amount of time.
Right, just at different times.
Yeah.
Which is sort of the part where you get that, you can introduce the jello and sort of the motion blur that comes from a rolling shutter.
Right, so you don't even avoid it with this. So actually, like the red is probably really good match to what old style rolling shutter would look like.
So I saw, there's two slides or two different shutters. There was the rolling shutter and then the global.
Yep. And so again, we're talking about different sets of technology, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're already into the weeds. But it's kind of good to understand why this happens with your camera. And so this is an explanation of why. There is a technology called global shutters, which are typically CCD based. And Alec, if I did get that backwards, I apologize because I think I chastised you on that one. But with the global shutter, all the pixels activate at the same time, and then it kind of takes longer to save. But the exposures between these two are equivalent. Right? It's just that with the rolling shutter on the left, as these pixels activate, right, you can see each row kind of gets brighter over time. Whereas it all happens at the same exact time on the global shutter. But these are meant to be running in parallel so that, this one is just saving data during part of the time where this one is exposing different portions of the sensor, if that makes sense. If this is confusing you, don't worry about it. The key thing to know is that if you wiggle your camera back and forth, or you pan too quickly, you might get this bend effect. That is really the heart of what this is all about. And just to paint one more picture of what's happening here, this is a nice image from Wikipedia. So on the left is the action that's happening, and on the right is the equivalent of the rolling shutter actually writing the image out, right? So as this kind of goes across, the car goes across, it just kind of bends. So a helpful explanation. And this is a graphic that animates if you click on this in the slides. All right, we are an hour in here. I think this is a good place to take a little 5-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about some more practical things about video production. All right, guys, welcome back. So we just finished our conversation about frame rates and shutter speeds and rolling shutter and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully you have some good takeaways. What frame rate should you start with? First cinematic look? 24 frames per second, shutter speed of 1/48th of a second. Great. Let's move on to moving the camera, right? We have this interesting thing that's happening where we're now dealing with time, right? It's no longer just one frame at a time. We have to consider the movement of our camera. Is it going to stay static? Or are we going to move it from place to place? What does our starting frame look like? And what does our ending frame look like? And and the in-between frames as well. I didn't put up a graphic for that. But in the same way that we kind of name our shot sizes, we also name our camera movements so that we can all be on the same page as we work with different crews and whatnot. So we have some images here to kind of describe the way that we move the camera. So the first up, what is this one called? One of the simplest camera movements, side to side. Anybody? Got any answers on the internet?
No, but I'm sure someone out there knows. Panning from Lindsay. Yeah.
Panning, yes. So this is a camera pan. Exactly. Just side to side. All right, here's a clip from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So we are panning across with this car. Cut into the garage. We're going to have another pan. Right. So along the horizontal axis, side to side. And so with this clip, for example, why is panning more interesting than just cutting from one fixed shot to another fixed shot? Like, why pan?
See the environment.
We get more environment, and it's also not given to us all at once necessarily, right? We kind of follow our subject along in this case. So, one reason. All right, so if side to side is panning, what is up and down? Tilting. Thank you, Max. You're cheating. All right, so this is tilting the camera. And sometimes you'll hear somebody say, oh, pan up with your camera. That's just technically incorrect, right? It's actually tilt up. And again, if we're working with a crew and we say, hey, your shot's a little bit low, I want you to tilt up a little bit, everybody should know exactly what you mean by that. All right, so up and down is tilt. All right, here's an example from The Return of the Jedi. Right, in a short little clip, but why did they tilt there, do you think? What did it do for us as a viewer? Yeah, let me play it back. Right, so we've got this kind of shot that establishes this carbonite being here. Like, why make that choice versus something else?
Keeps you engaged to see what's happening.
It's more engaging, right? It kind of, in the same way a pan kind of brought us across our landscape, right? This kind of unfolds how complicated this device is, right? It's a bit more mysterious.
And it would have been terrible if his hand just went out of frame.
It would have been terrible, yeah.
Because it's just, what happened?
And a wide shot, you wouldn't have all the detail of all this, right?
So Olivia's saying that it sort of follows the motion, right? But then it also gives you a perspective of the size of this object.
Good job, Olivia.
There's some revealing too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we'll get into some of the more fun camera moves that are harder to do. What is this one called? The camera literally like moving in and moving out. What is this called?
Man.
Ralph shaking his head.
You got nothing.
Anybody?
Dolly?
Dolly, yes. This is a camera dolly, right? The dolly, you either dolly in towards your subject or dolly out and widen out, right? We looked at the dolly zoom last week, where you do this in combination with zooming the lens of your camera out, which has a wild effect. I don't have that in this week's slides, but go back to Ian's lecture 2 weeks ago now, and you can see the dolly zoom. All right, should we look at an example? This is from Alien.
1979.
A nice slow dolly in here.
It's very smooth, very nice.
Very smooth.
Excellent.
Cool. So I'm seeing some oohs and ahs in the room here, but why? Like, why not just like pan over and show us the room? What is it that actually happens here? What happens to our shot size? What is this shot size? Wide, right? It gives us a sense of scale, but like the environment, right? We see the whole facade of this door, right? we're seeing it out of context of the rest of the movie, so I'm sure there's more information to see. But in this case, then what happens? What is our shot size like here?
That's sneaky. I didn't notice any of this. This is close up.
Yeah, it's closer, right? It's kind of hard to say. Yeah, it's close up, a close shot, right? And then we actually change again, right? What are we back to here?
Why?
A wide frame, right?
Did they zoom at all, or is the set like that perfectly?
Oh, my guess is there's no zoom here. This is probably just a fixed lens. But it's much more dramatic a reveal, right? We're kind of creeping in as the viewer into this space, right? It's kind of this bizarre space, and actually physically moving in, right? We're now thinking about our instead of one still image, it's our place over time, our position over time, and our understanding of this space changes as we get closer to it, right? And it's very different feeling than if we were just to cut from a wide shot to cut to a close-up shot, right? We've got this kind of unpacking along the way. So you have to think about over the course of your shot, what does your camera see, right? You don't want to start on a strong frame and then end with whatever. You want to go from strong frame to strong frame, right? But that's not the only way to use a dolly shot, of course. How about this example?
Pucker up, Buttercup.
What? Ferris Bueller's online too.
All right, so this is a comedic moment here, right, from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And we don't need to unpack the rest of the movie to kind of understand visually what happens here. But we go from, what shot size is this?
Medium close up.
Medium close up, right? We're from the chest up to the head. I would say that's a medium close up, right? We have a reverse or we come up to like more of a close up shot as he sits up, right? But then we get some news that changes something for our character, and we go from close up to like almost extreme close up, right? We're now cropping the top of the head and the bottom of the chin. And we've talked about this before when we talked about different shot sizes, but what does this do for us as a viewer? It connects us with him, right? His eyes are much larger, so we kind of get a better read on his emotion, right? So in this case, dollying in is really like brought us right up to feel what he feels with this awkwardness. And there's this silly element of sound design that, the horn kind of going wah, but much more effective than just staying on. Oops, sorry. By the end of this lecture, I will be really good at using my keyboard.
No pressure.
Much more effective than just staying on this shot and having the same sound design trick, right? Actually moving the camera in and being closer to our subject has done something different for us. So moving the camera in this case, I think, really helps this moment. All right. So instead of in and out, how about side to side, like this? It's called a truck.
No way.
Yep, side to side.
Dolly left to dolly right. That's so
Nope.
funny.
So,
why?
Yeah, but again, same thing. Like if you said dolly left, like we'd probably all know what you meant with that, right? But for the sake of clarity, truck left means my left. I'm going to move this way, or truck right means move this way. So, yeah. Just terms. Ian, do you have any history on this one? I don't know where the term actually comes from.
I wasn't even going to ask.
Yeah. So that's trucking left, trucking right. All right, so we'll get some more Ferris Bueller examples here.
This is common in movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Like a tracking shot.
yeah, kind of following along. But again, what is it that's more interesting about this movement than, say, a pan?
You're part of it. You're with it.
Yeah, we stay with him. That's a really good point. So, always consider the effect. All right, this one, like this.
Okay, but I just want is a ped.
Yep, a ped or a pedestal.
Are you serious?
Yep. So that's physically moving the camera up and down like this. Here's a shot, another Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference.
Oh, that's perfect.
But this one camera movement has done so much for us in this moment.
Ferrari.
The end is they just cut to the reverse shot of the car. So, talk me through this. Why is this the right choice here? Or is it the right choice here? Why not do something else? Right? To that point, like, this is all subjective, right? We're watching what somebody has done, but you absolutely could have chosen something else. You could have dollied into this shot and then ped it up, right? You could have cut from a low shot to their faces. Any thoughts on why this is more effective?
The timing of everything.
Timing, it's a big part of it.
And then the doors opening.
Yeah.
Come on, it was excellently executed.
I think Ian hit it on the head, right? You kind of anticipate this, right? You've got this kind of, you're like, what's going on here as you see this frame?
Well, that's Olivia.
Olivia? Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's really good insight there, Olivia. All right, we have one more camera movement. What is this direction? And so this is a combination of both trucking left and right and then dollying in and out. So you kind of move in this shape here.
I'm sure it has a silly name.
It doesn't. It kind of is self-descriptive, actually.
Yeah, it's the one that doesn't.
It's called an arc.
Are you
Right? So
kidding
this
me?
is arc left, arc right. And you typically kind of see these go in a more full circle, or at least 180 degrees. They're typically slightly longer shots. So let's look at an example. This is from Interstellar. Here's another arcing shot, which comes right after that. And yet another arc. So I think it's interesting because I think that those two arcing shots we just saw do different things. I guess I left the whole clip in here, so we'll back up. What does this one do?
It makes you see or feel that there's so much more around.
It kind of reveals the expanse of the environment, makes you feel it's kind of endless, right? In a way that just a wide shot wouldn't have done for us, right?
They were pretty bland.
Yeah. Okay. And then once we kind of come into this conversation that's happening inside the room here, what is it? How does this kind of keep the conversation moving for us? We can't even hear them, but.
It kind of makes you feel involved.
Yeah. All right, so it kind of makes you feel involved. Like
What
you're
does
part
it do to the
action.
space, right? It's the same exact camera movement, but it's done.
Tight.
Yeah, it sort of collapses the space and makes it much more intimate, right? This sort of conversation and claustrophobic, and we're in between people as we arc around. Whereas the first one, it showed how big everything was, and then the same camera movement just collapses everything. So context sort of matters a little bit.
Absolutely.
I hope our final projects don't have to look like this.
And you'll notice too, like oftentimes you'll see one, if they're going to cut together arcing shots like this, you're working in the same direction, right? So you very rarely will reverse the direction. And the same thing goes for pans. I don't have any slides about this, but you don't typically pan in one direction and then pan back. Because what's the point of that? You've already shown us this information. Why are we seeing it again? So when you pan, start at your starting point, end to your ending point, and there's no reason to then double back. Like my mom does this, for example. If she watches this video, I'm sorry, Mom, but she'll want to show this beautiful landscape. So she'll show it to you once and then show it to you again, and you're not really getting anything new. So, yeah.
You're in trouble.
Yeah, probably. All right, quiz time. What's the first one here? Not Ralph. Say it louder, I just can't hear. Pan? Tilt? Dolly? Pedestal? No, I didn't actually, I don't think we did this one. I skipped one. Roll. Yeah, so this is, I'll update the slides and put this in, but it literally is when you tilt the camera like this. It's just called a roll. Yeah, I don't have a clip. I missed it. I'm sorry, Ralph. All right, moving physically side to side. Truck. And then the last one that we just saw at the end where we kind of made this fun motion. Arc. All right. So let's talk about camera support now. We've seen all these kind of fun moves that you can do that you've seen some very expensive technology actually move the camera around. But do you need to have that expensive technology to do these camera moves? That's a question for the ages. So one of the most basic camera supports that you're going to use is a tripod. And you may or may not have access to these, but we see a tripod in a couple of different configurations. But it comes down to the actual legs of the tripod. This is called the tripod head. If you're shooting video, there are different heads than what you might use for photos. And actually, give me 1 second. Let me just grab an example of this. So this is a nice lightweight portable tripod. And it's got a quick release head so that you can easily change your angle very quickly. But if I wanted to pan on this, would this be a good tripod for this? No, not really. This is a still photo tripod head, and it's meant for one frame at a time.
Setting your frame and then changing your frame and setting your frame for single shots.
This is a fluid head tripod head, which is really what you want if you're doing video. They get very expensive, but on the low end side of things, it will still make it a world of a difference compared to trying to do it handheld or with a head that doesn't have any kind of fluid motion to it. So on the top of this, we have a quick release plate. This comes off very quickly so that you can change your camera out. This attaches to the bottom of your camera. Slide it in. All right, I'm going to check this one out later. I probably put it in backwards, but I'm going to pretend I didn't for the sake of the class. So this would swap out. I take this head off of this tripod, these tripod legs, and then put this on, and then we have a tripod head that is made for video. And I don't have the pan bar, but usually you often have a bar hanging out the side of it. It's called a pan bar, or pan arm, so that you can turn the tripod head as well without having to touch your camera. Those are your basic tripods. All right, when you want to travel more lightweight, but I guess really, let me back up for a second. When you're shooting on a camera that's very small, like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, they're just so typically lightweight, which is really nice if you're carrying them around. But when your hands shake from holding it, you see it in the footage often. And there is certainly camera stabilization that exists in sensors and lenses and whatnot that will produce this vibration. But oftentimes with a small, light camera, it just becomes hard to actually hold it and shoot video because everything shakes so much. So that's why we're talking about camera support.
So it's different from the concept of motion blur. So it's just that because you have frame after frame, you can see the actual movement of the camera, right? And it just sort of bounces around there.
Like the first shot in Saving Private Ryan. Well,
yeah, it was very, on purpose, right? To make it handheld and feel really frenetic and crazy. So you can use it to your advantage if you want to.
But I would say, what I'm describing is kind of hard to pinpoint. I should have put a clip of it in. I'm sorry, I didn't. But it's simply just holding a very lightweight camera in your hands and trying to move with it. Everything shakes in a way that is not the same as what you saw from Saving Private Ryan, right? Because that camera was probably a giant camera that was on, someone's shoulder and is stable because it's got a body actually stabilizing it. But there's something different about holding it in your hands and just the shake of your hands as you hold it and something that's so lightweight. So as you go out and shoot, you might see this if you're shooting handheld, which is fine, but just something to be aware of. So easy ways to kind of prevent the camera shake: use a tripod, use a monopod. This is like a one leg of a tripod that you can kind of pivot around onto. So it's kind of nice because you can get a little bit more of a handheld feeling with it, but not as much as just holding the camera on its own. But what's the downside to a tripod and a monopod, though? If we think back to our list of camera moves, right? Keeps us pretty static, right? It's hard to take this tripod and do a trucking shot. Like if I try to pull this along the stage, you can see how much this tripod head vibrates. Like that's not the right tool for the job.
That's a fail.
Yeah, exactly. All right, handheld. This is if you actually hold your camera as we described, but this is the kind of shake I'm describing. So I will say, if you're gonna hand hold your camera, use yourself as a tripod as much as possible. Take your elbows, sock them right into your body, and try to have as much contact as you can so that your camera moves as little as possible. Don't try to hold it out. Like you can't really see what their elbows are doing, but don't try to hold it out like this because then the entire extension of your arms is going to shake your frame. So bring your elbows in and hold the camera as close to your body as possible. A shoulder rig, right? This is, if you've got a little bit more money to spend, you might get something like this, or you might rent something like this. But at its most basic, there's a platform for a camera to sit on, some rods to kind of put it along and have a shoulder pad for your shoulder, and some handles to hold on to at its most basic. And then you kind of get the stability of a much larger camera rig, but with your much smaller camera. These tend to be, low hundreds of dollars, so not achievable for everybody, but the next step up in stability from just holding it in your hands. A dolly. What shot do we probably get with a dolly?
Truck.
Oh, that's not the first one though. Yeah, dolly, right? That'd be the first one you would think. Right, and so dollies take different forms, but their anatomy at its most basic is some kind of track and some kind of wheel system that rides along the track. This is a very fancy advanced dolly with a very big camera on it that has another arm that kind of booms up and down, or gives us the head movement up and down, but doesn't have to be this fancy. There are tabletop sliders like this, which are also fairly inexpensive, or things that you can rent, and the idea is the same, right? So you've got your video tripod head on it, and it slides side to side, or you can have it go in and out, so you can get a dolly or a truck shot from something like this as well. Right? And much more stable than trying to hold it in your hand and move along like this. So related but unrelated, like action cameras and drones are kind of all the rage these days. What's nice about drones in particular is that they tend to be stabilized. They have this electronic gimbal on them that adds stability and gives you a beautiful, smooth shot. We also have, for getting more interesting shots like this, the camera that can actually attach to your forehead, an action camera called a GoPro. What might be the downside of a little tiny camera like this?
Tiny sensor.
Tiny sensor, exactly. That's one thing, right? If we think about, there's still, GoPros have 4K resolution, but what good is a 4K sensor, or 4K resolution if your sensor is that small? You need to have what to make it look good? A lot of light. Exactly, Ralph. So if you don't have daylight, it's going to be hard to get good low light performance. One of the newer things that's come out is the electronic gimbal. The one on the left here is called the Movi. It was one of the first to market, but there are all kinds now like this that can hold your camera, and they're usually, this kind is usually sub $1,000, but really is very interesting to kind of see what it does. And I think this is really some of the breakthrough technology that we're seeing in our time for actually moving a camera around, because you can get so much versatility out of it. This is my fun analogy to a Movi. All right, so let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison of a shot that is stabilized with a gimbal and a shot that is handheld, just to get a sense of how much smoother it can be. Right, it's kind of crazy. The right feels more like the West Wing. The left kind of feels like your cousin picked up a camera and just followed somebody down the stairs, All right, let's look at this shot and see if we can guess how this was done. All right, so we'll call this the end of the shot. Any guesses as to how this is pulled off? What piece of hardware or pieces of hardware might have been involved?
Maybe a drone.
Maybe a drone. Okay, hearing a drone from the internet. Okay, we'll ignore that one for the moment. Somebody knows the answer. All right, let's watch a behind the scenes of how this was actually captured.
No way. One guy.
So I mean, it's
On a
just
bicycle?
it's kind of amazing how this technology has just changed the game, for lack of a better word. This has really kind of revolutionized how easy it is to stay. I mean, not everybody could ride a bike and hold a Movi at the same time. Let's be honest, right? But just the fact that you can change terrain like this. Like what would have taken, like how would you have even done this before, right? You would have rented a helicopter and done it that way, right? This before drones existed. You would have had a crazy dolly track setup, and even then, like the differential of terrain that you're going down, I don't even know that you could have done it.
They've done lots of stuff before with steady cams where
That's
they
true.
like run onto lifts and get lifted up so you can change floors and things like that. But yeah, I don't really think, like, not on this terrain you couldn't do it.
And it's so uneven. That's impressive.
Yeah, so
Simple.
all is to say, there are cameras that you can buy now that are fairly inexpensive too, that are gimbals with a lens on them and a sensor. So you don't even need something that you can put your camera into. You can buy one of these that already exists in this format. All right, so for time's sake, let's move on. Practically speaking, right? You're not going to go buy all this hardware right away. Renting it might be out of reach too, potentially. So what do we do? Cry. No, I mean, I think that you do the best you can, right? Like we talked about how to take a camera and hold it stably. Tripods are pretty easy to come across, but if you don't have a tripod, you can certainly set your camera down on a table or something at the right height, right? It just then becomes difficult to maybe pan or tilt. But I think the thing is you do the best you can. You'll get an opportunity to use a nicer piece of equipment, you take it and you experience it, and then you decide you can never go back. So, practically speaking, I think that you do the best you can.
I owned a wheelchair for a long time that I got from like a nursing home that was selling them off, that I would use on smooth floors like the stage or something like that, and I would just sort of put the camera in my lap and we could dolly in and out really nicely.
Yeah. Or if you work in an office, even an office chair.
Right.
Same
So
thing.
I mean, there are sort of creative solutions. Like there's been lots of shopping cart dollies over the years, I'm sure, in a lot of like student films and stuff like that. It's hard to get rid of the bounce though.
Yeah, and the noise. How do you get rid of the noise?
Yeah, so with the shopping carts, it's not easy. You need like a really smooth floor. Like you could do it you can't do it on concrete. And then there's other dollies too that run like skateboard dollies that run on PVC pipe and things like that. They're very like sort of like low tech solutions to give you some movement.
So DIY basically.
Yeah, there are some definite DIY solutions, and then it gets as sophisticated as some of the stuff that we saw there with, pneumatic, hydraulic booming arms and things like that.
Yeah. All right. So we have 2 more pivots tonight before the class ends, so we're going to keep moving on. So let's talk about continuity, which is really the representation of time through space, right? You want the goal typically is smooth flow of time, right? From moving a person across the screen, transitioning from one scene to another. We want to start to think about what direction people are entering our frames from, and maybe where they're going, the direction that they're looking, and how do they exit as well. Let's see, make sure I'm not going to lose anything here. All right, so a few tips are, just always be aware of that kind of thing as you're shooting, right? If somebody comes in to your scene entering left to right, you want to preserve that probably as they continue walking. You don't want to cut to a shot where they're then immediately walking the other direction. We'll look at some examples of this. Think about the transitions. If you're going to have somebody come into your scene, do they walk through a door? Do they just walk in from out of frame? What is their actual transition? And then how do you transition from that scene to the next scene? Does the person walk out of the frame? Does the person just stay standing there and you cut to the next scene? Things to just start to consider as you put your scene together. And I think one of the best ways to actually determine what feels good for you is to just watch films, watch TV, and see what is done and see what you like. And if you break continuity, do so intentionally. So we talked a little bit about preserving screen direction. But so one handy rule that is kind of the baseline for preserving continuity is called the 180-degree rule. Does anybody have a quick definition of what this is offhand? All right. Well, let's unpack it. Let's first watch this scene with no sound of a conversation between 2 people from Good Will Hunting. All right, so we have 2 people sitting in a room and talking. We've got this kind of reverse shot where we're seeing one half of the conversation, then we flip over the other person's shoulder and see the other half of the conversation. Right? We're kind of going in closer, we're punching out wider, depending on what's happening. But this feels very natural, right? Everybody's looking in the right direction. Okay? So where would we put the cameras to actually capture this? Right, think of this as like a bird's eye plot. Where would we put the camera?
Behind Matt Damon's right shoulder.
All right, so Ralph, you're saying here.
And
So where would you put the camera on the other side, behind Robin Williams?
the same thing went in reverse, but it'd be 2 different takes.
So over his right shoulder. So this is his right shoulder.
His left shoulder.
Left shoulder. And why would you choose one versus the other?
No, I would shoot it through the same shoulder.
Okay. I'm kind of being vague and asking confusing questions to kind of tease this out. But this is what the 180 degree rule defines for us. So what it is this line between two characters looking. Sometimes it's called the line of action, but it's established by this kind of direction of the character's gaze, and we need to kind of pick a side of the line to be on, right? So we can pick this side or we can pick this side. They will both feel different, but we need to stay on the same side of this line.
So don't break the line ever. Unless it's
There is intention to break the line, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So you might put your camera on this side of Robin Williams, and if we're staying on this side of the line, that means our camera behind Matt Damon needs to go over here, right? So there are two cameras, and if we wanted to have a wide shot, where would we put that? Tanya's pointing this way, this side of the line, right? Yes, so we put our wide shot back here if we were going to get both characters. What would happen if we put a camera over here?
I don't know, man.
Let's visualize it, okay? So if our camera's over here, this is the image we get. We get the Matt Damon in our foreground, looking screen right. Robin Williams, frame right, looking screen left, right, as far as their gaze goes, which is appropriate with this picture that we're looking at. If we look at the reverse shot, we've got the camera over Robin Williams' shoulder, so his camera's in the foreground, frame right, with Matt Damon frame left, or frame center, right? But looking opposite directions. If we put it over the other shoulder, what happens is that his gaze direction flips, and they are now both looking in the same direction. So if you were to cut back to these, there no longer feels like they're looking at each other. They're both looking in the same direction like they're talking to somebody else. And it's just very unnatural. But when you're going to do your first setup, if you've got multiple people in a room, it's really easy to kind of confuse this and not know exactly where to place the camera. So it's important to think about, like, what you want is them to obviously look towards each other in the same direction. And so it's important to kind of think about what that would look like as far as look direction and whatnot. So let's draw a little bit and come up with a couple scenarios here. All right, so let's say we have two people. I'm drawing from overhead, so that's someone's shoulders, that's their head, that's their nose. All right, another person they're talking to, that's their head, that's their nose. Where is our line of action, or our 180 degree line? Right through them, nose to nose. Let's use a different color here. We'll use red. All right, great. Where do we place our cameras?
Isn't this the first one's our choice, right?
Yeah, right. One side or the other, we should choose.
All right.
Yeah. All right. So we'll just say we'll put one here. We'll put one here, right? And our wide shot would be over here. Anything in this, not hemisphere, this half of our area would be fine, right? If we cross to the other side, it means that someone's going to be looking in the wrong direction. That is essentially what the 180 degree rule defines for us. All right. What happens if the setup gets a little bit more complicated? Let's say here's our person. And there's our person. They're looking opposite each other. Go back to red.
Same line, I would assume.
Okay. So I think that there are a couple ways to cover it, but yeah, I draw the same line as you. Right?
Are they talking to each other?
It depends. Like if they turn, so this is what can affect our line, is if somebody looks in a different direction, that can change everything, right? Or if somebody, like a glance, like if somebody else enters the scene and you, like now you have three people talking.
Well, it's almost like if you and I were talking, right? The line is between Dan and I,
Yep.
right? And then all of a sudden we turn to talk to you. Now there's another line here, right? And so we basically have all of our cameras on sort of this side of the line, and now there's a line here, and we actually have a bunch of cameras that are still over there. So we're sort of maintaining our 180 degree. It'd be really weird if we were talking and all of a sudden there was a camera flipped to the back here or something like that, or this camera picked us up. So
Yeah.
it's really about the line of action, right? What's happening in the scene and how are you covering it? And the goal is to make coherent space, right? Like look direction and the direction people watch needs to be consistent, or it's hard for us to understand like actual volume as represented as a sequence of shots, right? Of two-dimensional images back to back to back to back.
Yeah. So I was going to draw 3 people, but does that cover it enough for everybody? Maybe we'll just draw it real quick. So if we have 3 people, let's say these 2 people start talking to each other. Forgive my poor drawing, right? Our line is like this, and then person number 3 walks in like this. Where does the line go? Part of this depends on where we put the cameras to begin, right? So let's say we have a camera here, and a camera here, and then we pivot. This is our wide shot as the other person walks in.
That makes sense.
Can depend on kind of who we follow too. Something like that. It really kind of depends on the setup and which shot you're following, but it will feel, you'll know it when you see it. When you make your first cut that breaks this rule, you will see it because everybody will just be looking in the wrong direction. All right, let's look at an example of this now. Another clip from the same episode of Mr. Robot, and they break this rule in here, so see if you can spot it. All right, maybe we could dim the lights for this one.
But I can't. No, really, this was you. You are seriously the best person I know. You know that? I love you so much. Oh my God, Elliot, what the fuck?
I'm sorry.
What the hell is wrong with you?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought I'm sorry.
Oh my God, Elliot. Did you forget again? Did you forget who I am?
All right.
What do you mean?
Let's draw what we're seeing here. All right, so we got 2 people talking to each other. Person 1, person 2, sitting like this. All right, where are the cameras placed? Let me do this, keep this in my hand.
Kind of on the right shoulder.
Yeah, and how far over are we? Like if we think about, like, you know, we could get a shot from here, or we could get a shot from here, right? If let's draw the line. Where's the line between them? Right there, yeah. So when they turn to look all the way at each other, it's like this. Let me draw this in red. Right? So at their most extreme when they're looking, that's our line. And so we can go, what we're saying with the 180 degree rule is that we can place our cameras anywhere in this part, right? Because if we look at what they did, we're on this side of them, right? We're on this side. So the first camera is probably here, right? Because we have a lot in our foreground of Elliot, our character, with the background. And so how extreme is the other angle on the reverse side? Let me skip forward ahead a little bit.
Almost the same.
Almost the same, yeah, exactly. So we're probably like something like that, right? And so there's balance there, right? It would be interesting to maybe put the camera here, right? Would this be okay to do? Or we lose this person entirely? Yeah, right? There's no rule kind of around that, but that would be a clean shot instead of having this person in the foreground kind of dirtying our frame, right? It just feels very different. So it's very natural to kind of match our coverage here. All right. Do we have any other shots happening here? So back and forth, shot, reverse shot. Here's another angle. Where's this camera?
Bottom there.
Yeah, just down here somewhere, right? So those are the setups we've seen so far.
I think when you said I'm sorry, I do it completely different.
So where do the cameras go here?
I didn't notice at all.
You didn't notice it?
No. I was looking for it.
So this camera is kind of like our subject here is her, right? We're kind of over Elliot's shoulder slightly. So if this, let's just say this is Elliot. That camera's like here, right? Because they are flipped orientation-wise. And even look at the background of what's going on. That's the other tell for you, right? We've been looking, behind them has been kind of like lights and city. But as we flip here, there's this, and then bang. There's the beach all of a sudden, right? Totally different. They're looking in the opposite directions. The background is different. Everything about this is very jarring for us as the viewer, which is kind of what's happening to him, right? That might be the reason that they did this, because this is a very kind of confusing moment. And it's just this one shot. After this, we go right back to where we were, right? Now we're back to, she's no longer in the frame, right? Now we have this shot here. Does that make sense?
So like all things, it's most effective when used very judiciously.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly. I point this out more to say try not to break this because, again, I think exactly, use it judiciously. It is hard to execute well. And just to close it out, the last camera shot was from that angle there, right? So, but all intents and purposes, to keep preserve screen direction and look direction, keep it on one side of the line or the other. They could have totally shot in the other direction and had the beach in the background the whole time. That would have been totally fine. What would it have done, actually? I'm curious. Let's look at this for a second.
It would have lost the kicker lights on the side of the face.
You would have lost lights on the side of the face, okay. But if we had put the cameras on the other side of them, right, over this shoulder over here, like where Ian is, as far as their body's position goes, how would it be different?
We wouldn't be on the front, what we see from the back.
Yeah, but we'd be like kind of behind them, which also feels very different. And I don't have a clip of it to show you, but like it's more closed off,
yeah,
potentially, right? Their bodies are kind of open to the camera here, even though they're overlapping in the frame. I think where you think about where you put your camera in position to the conversation as well, we'd feel less a part of the conversation and more alienated from it.
So are you saying this is a bad example?
No, they did this intentionally, I think. So it's more to show you how this can be used to effect. But as you kind of get started, if it's your first time going out to shoot a video, I find that it's easy to kind of do this unintentionally. And so it's
So what should I think? If it's like awkward, like the first time when I played it, I realized like it's not follow the 180-degree rules and it feels very awkward.
Feels very awkward. Yeah, and so, but this is subjective, right? Like maybe you think, wow, what are they doing? They totally messed up. My guess is it's intentional.
Well, I think we can look at the sort of the moment is this matches the narrative intent of the scene, right? This sort of like a big psychological switch with this character, and in doing so, to like sort of seed the confusion and sort of make us sort of jump a little bit. They broke the visual continuity, and there's this sort of like something's different, something's wrong. People flip direction. Like you're a little bit confused and then they go back. And so in this instance, it matches the narrative intent, right? Which is what we're sort of talking about all through this course. But when you're setting up a scene where it's just Dan and I talking about, what we had for breakfast, if you jump the line, there's no narrative to match that to. Now it's a mistake, right? And so just being aware of how to properly show a scene that's coherent, and then when you can change it to sort of give your narrative some punch or something like that.
Yeah, and Tian, right? If you, like, the question is it too much punch, right? That is subjective, and absolutely for you it might be too much, like for me it might not be, but I think that is kind of where we come at it as viewers, and at the end of the day you need to go out and just make something and let your audience decide if it works or not too. So, but at the end of the day, make it for yourself, and if you're happy with it, that's really the most important thing. All right, so it can be broken intentionally, right? But it is foundational and fundamental to understand for how you establish relationships between people and make sure that your viewer understands who's talking to who. All right, but know that it can be changed by somebody else walking in or something else happening and your character glancing in another direction. So just be aware and give it some thought. I'm going to blow through a few more slides here. The 20% or 30% rule, this basically says, when you're changing from one shot to another, change things by more than 20%. Because if you, let's see, I think I have an example of this. So you want to change either your focal length or your zoom level or the axis of your camera, right? So don't cut to a shot from here to the same shot size from the same position of something slightly different, right? So if you're covering this flying car taking off, for example, what you don't want to do once it starts moving is cut to the same size thing, right? This feels like a jump cut. What you want to do is cut from a car taking off to something that's 20 or 30% different, whether it's the size of the car, whether it's the angle of view, the position of the camera, right? You want to cut to something that's just very different so that it doesn't feel like a jump cut and feel awkward. You can feel in the first version of this just how awkward the cut was. So I think this kind of a stretch here with the flying car, but if you're shooting people, you don't want to cut from a medium shot to a medium shot of the same person from a different angle, right? You want to change that shot, or you want to change the position, or cut to the reverse shot first. All right, let's talk about actually covering a scene. How do you go about, let's say you're gonna work with an actor and a camera operator, and you've got a crew at your disposal. How might you cover the scene? You want to shoot it a few different ways, get a few different angles. You might use something called the master shot and coverage approach. And that is where you're going to shoot this several times. So you shoot a wide shot of the scene, right? And shooting the wide shot first is helpful versus shooting the close-ups because it gives your actors a chance to kind of practice the movement, right? You're not going to notice the discrepancies in performance as they kind of work it out if you're on the wide shot, right? And then you want to work your way in on each side of the scene. So this is your coverage of the scene. So you've got your master shot or your wide shot. And then let's say you've got two people talking next to each other. You want the coverage of person one, and then you're going to get, let's say, the medium shot of them doing the same action, repeating the same scene. And then maybe you go in for the close-up of the same thing. And if you think back to our super coverage homework that you did when you had multiple shot sizes to choose from, right? We shot this in the same way. And then after you get person one, you might flip to the other side and shoot person two. So you start with your medium shot of them, and then you move to your close-up shot of them. That is the master shot and coverage approach to covering a scene. You work your way in from one side and then the other. This is where you have control, and you can do it multiple times. What if you're going to get a building blowing up, being demolished? You can't really do that multiple times, right? So there's another method called the overlapping method, and this is much more akin to documentary or something where you just have much less control. And so the idea is that you start with your establishing shot, but you don't go through the whole scene. So maybe this is where you have a wide shot of the building, you've got your construction vehicles pulling up, you cut to, you kind of pause the action, you say, hold on a second, construction crew, right? You go up, you get the guy coming out of the bulldozer and the wrecking ball, you get a close-up shot of him kind of coming out of the truck, right? Action progresses a little bit, and then you back up to your super wide shot for the actual building dropping. You're kind of shooting this all sequentially, where you leave padding between, where you can actually overlap the action that you're seeing so that you have room to actually make an edit. So two different kind of styles for covering scenes, right? Change the position, get the next segment, and then repeat. So two different styles depending on what you're covering. For further reading on all of this kind of thing, this is a great resource. The DSLR Cinematography Guide, it is free. You just have to sign up for their newsletter. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. But it covers everything about getting started in video production, and it's a really easy read. They cover everything that we've kind of covered in this course so far as well. But they specifically are good for video. All right, we're pretty much out of time. I have some slides on here for doing some pre-production. I just want to touch on a couple of them, and then the rest of them are really just assets for you to have as you go out and start doing actually shooting. Budget, we're just going to wave our hand at for now because at this point, your budget can be $0 for this class, right? We don't expect that you are spending much on anything. All right, shot lists and visual translations. A shot list is really important, I think, because it'll make sure that you don't miss anything when you go out to shoot. So there's a link to this example here if you want to use this template, but you number your shots, you list what the subject is going to be, what shot size you want it to be. You can figure out, put as much detail or as little detail as you want, but the idea is that this is a spreadsheet that'll kind of help you understand what it is you need to get. So when you get to your location and you're ready to shoot, you can literally go down and say, okay, did we get this shot? Did we get this shot? Did we get this shot? And in pre-production, when you're planning your shoot, you can think about what kind of shots it is that you want to get. I realize this is a really fast overview, but I want to get to storyboards in particular. The other thing that I recommend as you're starting to piece together what it is you're going to do is make storyboards. And that is literally where you kind of draw the keyframe of each shot as you go through your sequence. You can add arrows to kind of show, hey, I want the camera to kind of move in and get closer here. So you get a sense of the scale and position of the characters. And if you're working with a crew, this is really handy to show your camera operator and say, hey, this is kind of what I'm imagining for the shot. So really handy. I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward to describe, but then your shot numbers can match your shot list so that you can have a very quick translation between your shots. So some good examples here from our friend Dean. A camera plot, we kind of did this on the big whiteboard here as we kind of figured out where we wanted to place cameras, but it's helpful to figure out where your line of action is going to be. And so if you're shooting a scene, let's say for this class or for your first narrative piece that you want to go do, helpful to do this for each kind of setup that you're going to do. Just draw it out. Locations, again, I'm going to wave my hand at this stuff. This is more to have some resources, but there are certain things you want to think about when you go and actually are trying to get a location and you're going to bring a crew to it in particular. Like, where are the bathrooms? Is it close to an airport? Is there air traffic going by overhead for sound? How much power is there? How is there Wi-Fi? Like all those kinds of questions you want to ask. This checklist is just something to take with you so that you can remember to check off all the boxes as you go. If you are working with more than one or two other people, it's helpful to have a call sheet. This is just one page of information that you would send out to the crew about the details of your shoot, right? So you've got a sound guy, you've got a makeup person, you've got your actors, you've got a camera crew. It starts to become helpful to have all this information in one place. So again, just a template that you can download and look at, a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but just to know what happens when you get with slightly bigger productions. This is the bottom half of the same sheet. And a contact sheet, any old spreadsheet will do. But again, just giving you some template resources for this kind of thing. We got asked about this early on in the class, a talent release form. Here's kind of a generic one to use. Depending on the needs of your production, you may or not need this. It's basically getting someone's permission to use them if you're going to publish your media, right? For the sake of this class, everything's going to stay private and just within this class. But after this, you might want to release your project to the world, and you should have permission for that. And so this is kind of a generic release form that'll kind of grant permission. Again, you can download this. It's from a website, and use it as you see fit. And this is really helpful. So I think that if nothing else for this class, you should print this out and take it with you. And you may not need everything on this list, but it'll at least make you think about what you're going to do. Because the worst thing to do is to get ready for a shoot, get your actor or whoever you're working with there, and not have something, right? You forgot your batteries or you forgot your media card. Like, it happens to all of us, but it is totally preventable. And make a checklist or bring. I think this is like gear list bingo, right? Make sure that you can at least go through and say, okay, I have all the pieces that I need out of this or the related pieces. So again, another downloadable form that you can take and borrow with you as you shoot. So a few summarizing thoughts on the next slide, but I'm not even going to read them to you. You can read them off the slides. And that concludes our intro to video production in this class. The next assignment has been posted, so if you want to take a look at that, feel free. Are there any questions before we wrap things up tonight? That was a speedy end to this. I'm sorry to rush through it. I just don't want to keep everybody late. We're happy to stick around and answer questions. All right, if there's nothing, thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week.